Japanese automotive enthusiasts were almost wired to despise these massive SUVs. But what if one of them was actually good? What if one of them set the precedent for what the entire cursed generation would become? What if one of them was actually used for benevolence and not greed? The Porsche Cayenne. Believe it or not, in the 1980s, Porsche was actually not doing too well. The 959, while brilliant and revolutionary in the auto industry, was losing the company millions due to its incredibly high-tech features and production costs. Then, to add insult to injury, the dollar's exchange rate plummeted, which meant that these European companies suddenly had a lot higher valued currency, which means it was more expensive to purchase stuff, which means profits fell as net costs increased. And finally, just to add the final nail in the theoretical coffin, Porsche sales in general were slumping. By 1993, only 14,000 cars a year were sold. Porsche needed something desperate. So they tried the Boxster. And the Boxster was very helpful. It got them back to break even. However, companies can't really sustain themselves at a break-even pace. So they needed something a bit more radical. And that's when they looked to America. And they saw the rise of vehicles like the Jeep Grand Wagoneer, the Ford Explorer, and the Toyota RAV4, and decided, what if we make one of those tall car thingies? And they went out to build the first SUV in their lineup. Rules: it had to be high riding, it had to be off-road capable, it had to be large. Basically, the polar opposite of every single Porsche ever made up to this point. Yes, I know Porsche did have off-roading experience with the Dakar in the 1980s, but an SUV is an entirely different animal. The biggest challenge, by far, was to make a massive SUV handle like a Porsche should handle and look like a Porsche should look. That meant that there were some 911 styling cues thrown into the design, with a wider rear stance, the headlights were similar, and a narrow hood were implemented in the design. Then, in order to make it handle a little better, the chassis was a unibody mixed with ladder frame elements, which is very bizarre for an SUV. Most SUVs, certainly of the late 90s, early 2000s, were ladder frame only. They were basically pickup truck frames with an SUV body put on them. But after a few years of development, the Cayenne 955 finally debuted in 2003 to a mixed reception. Porsche purists were about to commit ritual suicide over the horror of a new SUV, especially because it came in a V6 gas or diesel versions? What? But to everyone else, it was brilliant, it was comfortable, it was quiet, it was very spacious, it could store a lot of stuff. And if you got the Turbo S version, which had a 4.8 liter twin turbocharged V8, making 550 horsepower to all four wheels, it was fast as well. It could do 0 to 60 in under 5 seconds at a top speed of 171 miles an hour. It was the fastest SUV in the world and the world's first sports SUV. Well, I like to call it the SS SUV. Because sport, utility vehicle, so sport, utility vehicle. But whatever. It was fast in a straight line for sure. It was very comfortable, very spacious. But what about the other criteria, like handling? Well, it had massive ceramic composite brakes, and it had fancy suspension with adjustable air shocks. It was a pretty good vehicle for what it was. It wasn't exactly a Ferrari, but for an SUV, this had never been seen before. And Porsche tackled the off-roading aspect as well, with a low-range gearbox and locking differentials. And they proved it was capable of off-roading when they took 25 Porsche Cayennes to the 2007 Trans-Siberian Rally, What is that? You take modified road cars and drive 4,400 miles from the capital of Russia, Moscow, to the capital of Mongolia, Ulaanbaatar. That means no small feat crossing the Ural Mountains, the Altai Mountains, subarctic forests, and the Gobi Desert. Not only did most of those Porsches finish, they completely locked out the podium. It was so good, they even made 600 road cars in celebration. And all of that praise, and all of that success meant that by 2008, Porsche were selling twice as many Cayennes as 911s. This vehicle single-handedly saved Porsche. It didn't just make them profitable, it gave them so much cash, they finally went through with their concept and built the Carrera GT hypercar. The 955 was moved into the 958 in 2011. It was larger, with more cabin space and more trunk space, but thanks to new materials and construction, it was 10% lighter than previous models. That's a lot when your vehicle weighs 5,000 pounds. Of course, it also helps that they got rid of that whole low-range gearbox because no one buying a Cayenne would dare to see a speck of dirt on their fancy shoes. Meanwhile, the Turbo S ditched its old V8 in favor of the Panamera's twin-turbo V8, making 562 horsepower. Now, there was a diesel version, but that was reduced, shall we say, thanks to a new hybrid model in Dieselgate, which was launched in 2014. The E-Hybrid had a 46 horsepower electric motor paired with a base model V6 that could get 46 mpg, which is surprisingly good for what is a building on wheels. And in 2014, it got a little baby brother with the crossover Macan. That was crap, and we're not going to talk about it anymore. But the Cayenne was still a brilliant, practical machine, and it showed that by towing the heaviest object ever for a production car, when back in 2017, it pulled a 265-ton Airbus A380 jumbo jet. Which brings us on to the most recent third-gen Cayenne. Launched in 2018, instead of being based on its own platform, it is now sharing the Volkswagen MLB platform. And while there's still the usual base models with the hybrids and the V6s and whatnot, the diesel's completely gone. The turbo is now the fastest non-hybrid Cayenne at 542 horsepower. Now I say non-hybrid because the Turbo S now uses the standard hybrid system, creating a joint 671 horsepower. It can do 0 to 60 in 3.2 seconds, and the quarter mile faster than a Ferrari 458. It's a 2.5-ton, all-wheel drive SUV that can go faster than a Ferrari and pull a G in the corners. Porsche have mastered the art of defying physics with the rear-engined, naturally aspirated 911s. But with this Cayenne Turbo S, they have simply disintegrated and moved into a new realm of physics. I don't understand how that's possible, but they're gonna make a faster one. How do I know that? Because in 2019 they launched the Cayenne Coupe, launched as a sportier, i.e. worse version of the Cayenne, because it's the exact same vehicle with less headroom and less storage. But the reason why I say there's a faster one is because there have been sightings of a GT version at the Nürburgring with a rumored 800 horsepower. I don't know how fast that thing is lapping the ring right now, but what I do know is that the 2017 Cayenne Turbo S, the previous generation, non-GT version, lapped the ring in under 8 minutes. This thing is going to eviscerate all SUVs to come. Lamborghini Urus, get out of here. Aston Martin DBX, get out of here. Ferrari Pulsang, get lost. The Cayenne has been the standard for sports SUVs, and regardless of whether or not you like them or not, you have to admire this one and you have to thank it, because without the Cayenne, we would not have the Carrera GT. We might not have the GT3 RS. Hell, we might not even have Porsche as a whole without this vehicle. So, regardless of your stance on their practicality and functionality and purpose, the Cayenne is one of the exceptions to the otherwise terrible formula.